in the case of the US-led empire, its greatest strength, which I just discussed, the coverage of the planet, is also its greatest weakness. It cannot sustain coverage of the entire planet. It just cannot. And, a lot of Latin American thinkers will say that whenever the US has gotten bogged down in our region, in the Middle East, West Asia, that's when socialist movements have come to power and really bloomed in Latin America, because the people are able to practice self-determination when the US is distracted elsewhere. And what we're seeing now is the US completely bogged down in our region through its support of Israel and its own mercenaries and soldiers on the ground. And other places are blossoming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Since October 7th, the US-led imperialist order has unleashed an apocalyptic hell onto the people of Gaza to defend their settler vassal state, Israel. Yet the people of Gaza and the region have refused to submit. Is the fierce resistance to the genocide in Gaza a sign of an imperialist system in crisis? What are the various anti-imperialist fronts aligned against the US around the world? And what's China's role, if any? What are the characteristics and contradictions of this US-led imperialist order? And in what ways are the chickens coming home to roost in the US and Europe? Here to discuss this and more is Nina Farnia, assistant professor of law at Albany Law School, a longtime activist, and a scholar of critical race theory, with a focus on US imperialism and its impact on domestic law. Her forthcoming book is called Imperialism, an American Story. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Nina, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. I want to let everybody know that you were on the show, I think almost exactly a year ago. And people can go check out that episode. We had a pretty lengthy discussion about Iran's role in the anti-imperialist struggle and some Iranian history that actually is even more relevant today as we witness huge shifts across the region because of the genocide in Gaza. So I'm really excited to talk to you about imperialism in its role. US-led imperialism, I should say. Because it's so crucial to understanding what's happening in Gaza, in the Middle East, in the world at this moment. We're at a crucial point in history. I think we can both agree on that. So I think a good place to start with this is maybe, to kind of define or explain what we're talking about when we say US-led imperialism. So what are the characteristics of modern day US-led imperialism? And I always do like 2 or 12-pronged questions. So I'll just add to that. Is this a system in crisis? And if so, why is it in crisis?
So there's like a really long answer and a semi-long answer. So I'll try to do the semi-long answer. So US imperialism is somewhat distinct from the other major empires that we've seen in modern history. So, for example, the Spanish Empire is well known for being characterized by direct rule. The Spanish had viceroys that landed in South America and the Caribbean, and they basically the viceroys directly controlled the people. They created an elaborate racial hierarchy, like very, very elaborate racial hierarchy, and that was used to really control the land and the resources and the people. The British Empire is largely characterized by indirect rule, which means that they ruled through local communities and local officials, and divide and conquer. The division and conquering of local peoples across ethnic or religious lines was also characteristic of British Empire. But it was really driven by local peoples under the control of the Brits. The U.S. empire is a bit different, and a lot of scholars have called it an empire of military bases because there are at least 800 known military bases covering the planet, American military bases covering the planet. But that's not really a complete or sophisticated understanding of what's actually happening. Because in addition to the economic aspects of imperialism that a lot of your guests have covered in the past, there's also militarism and politics. Politics are a key aspect of U.S. imperialism especially, but imperialism in general. And the U.S. rules largely through proxy powers. Each continent has a series of proxies, of American proxies, vassal states, that basically execute the American agenda in order to gain control of a particular land and its resources. So, for example, in Africa, you've got Rwanda. A lot of folks call Rwanda the Israel of Africa, right? There's Rwanda, there's Egypt, Uganda, Kenya, which now has a quote unquote special relationship with the US. We can talk about that later when we talk about Haiti. In Asia, there's the Philippines, there's South Korea. Obviously, there's Israel. Israel is by far, I think, I would argue, the most significant American vassal in the world. And then in Latin America, there are a series of proxies as well. So these proxy powers are critical because they execute the American agenda. They basically operate as the sort of the militaristic arm, right, of the empire. They invade, and then these invasions are often called civil wars, right? So the American public is led to believe that, for example, what's happening in the Congo is a quote unquote civil war, right? When it's really not. It's Rwanda operating on behalf of the Americans to take control of land and resources there. Americans tend to think that what's happening in Palestine is a war between Jews and Muslims, right? This is reminiscent of the divide and conquer strategy that the Brits used. But in fact, it's not. It's a war of colonialism. Israel colonized the region with the support with the support and approval of the Americans and initially the Europeans. And that's what it is. It's a war of colonialism. So the proxies are critical, and they execute the American agenda through sort of kind of like if we were to simplify it, kind of like a carrot and stick approach, right? The carrot is foreign aid, for example, is the carrot. Dollar dominance, the use of the dollar, is another carrot. And then the stick is U.S. sanctions or multilateral sanctions, UN sanctions. And then obviously the threat of wars and invasions and things like that. The other key aspect of U.S. imperialism that I think is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important, is that it covers the entire planet. And this is very different than anything we've seen in the past. So we talk a lot about how this is the strongest empire in history because of the resources, the technology, the access to weaponry, but it also covers the entire planet. And I don't mean by covering the entire planet that it covers every square kilometer or mile, right? I mean that with some lead time, it can strike anywhere in the world. Or with a few keystrokes, it can completely shut down access to capital or banks for any nation, just with a few keystrokes. And when I talk about being able to strike anywhere around the world, it largely does this through its occupation and colonization of islands, either in the Pacific, especially either in the Pacific region or the Caribbean. So there are a whole host of islands in these two regions that are directly colonized, either by the US or Europe. So if you look up like existing colonies around the world that are like due to become independent through peaceful processes over the next couple decades, the majority of them are islands, and mostly either in the Caribbean or in the Pacific. And so when we, like the Kanaki struggle that's happening right now in what we call New Caledonia, that's a very, very important struggle being led by a socialist National Liberation Front to free the island of the French, which really means of US-led imperialism. If these islands are freed and liberated, that will be a massive strike to US-led imperialism around the world, in addition to what's happening in our region, right, in Gaza and Palestine. I'll just add one thing. So when we look sort of through the genealogy of anti-imperialist thought, the intellectual history of anti-imperialist thought, we think of Lenin as, sort of the forefather, right, the originator of this. And what Lenin said in Imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, in like the second paragraph, is that because of Tsarist censorship, his analysis of imperialism in that volume largely is theoretical, and it's focused on economics. That he cannot, because of censorship, speak about politics in the way that it should be spoken about with regard to imperialism. So what came from that, right? All the great anti-imperialist thinkers we've had since then have focused quite a bit on economics and militarism as well. But the question of politics and of the politics that undergird the imperialist project, that's been given less attention by the great thinkers. And the American, I would say probably the British project as well, but the American project in particular, the American imperialist project, relies heavily on politics. It wouldn't be able to dominate the world through the dollar. I mean, this is changing, right? But dominate the world through the dollar without politics. It wouldn't be able to use foreign aid to coerce nations into doing what it wants without politics. And those politics have a lot to do with race and racial ideology, in addition to a host of other things. So, and Lenin actually in that second paragraph actually also talks about the law and how legal systems, he can't talk about them. The international legal system and the international institutions that we've been talking a lot about lately, like the ICC, these are political institutions that are upholding imperialism. And this is also has not been given a lot of attention, the role of the law in upholding imperialism, either within the US or abroad.
Well, no, that's a really important explanation. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't talk about crisis. Should I talk about the
crisis?
Well,
I also just want to note, I really appreciate the distinction you make between past empires and the current U.S. empire, which I just want to throw in, I assume is something that you probably go into even more in depth in your forthcoming book about American imperialism. But that is what makes it much scarier. And it's also its destructive capacity. Like you said, it has the ability to bomb anywhere it wants to on the planet. And so, yeah, let's go to the crisis question, because after laying out what the U.S.-led imperialist order consists of, is it a system in crisis? And I want to put that in the context too of the fact that, and we're going to talk about this, that there are so many different fronts aligned against it at the moment, and they're not necessarily collaborating together around the world, but they exist in every continent at this point, which I think is also unique. At this moment in history. So yeah, and also when I think about the genocide in Gaza and the fact that there is a fierce resistance to that and in the region, and just the destructive capacity, the apocalyptic hell that the US and its allies have unleashed in Gaza, does seem to speak to some level of anxiety about about their current system. So all that's to say, is this an imperialist order in crisis?
So yes, definitely. And I mean, empires historically, and all the great thinkers have said this, right? That empires come and go, right? They last maybe a few hundred years, a little bit more than a few hundred years at best. And so, it would be ridiculous for anyone to think that this empire, this American empire, is going to last, just based on what we know of history. But there are some specificities that will make the fall of this empire different somewhat than the others, and maybe even accelerate it. In the case of the US-led empire, its greatest strength, which I just discussed, the coverage of the planet, is also its greatest weakness. It cannot sustain coverage of the entire planet. It just cannot. And, a lot of Latin American thinkers will say that whenever the US has gotten bogged down in our region, in the Middle East, West Asia, that's when socialist movements have come to power and really bloomed in Latin America, because the people are able to practice self-determination when the US is distracted elsewhere. And what we're seeing now is the US completely bogged down in our region through its support of Israel and its own mercenaries and soldiers on the ground. And other places are blossoming. Self-determination and self-reliance in other places is blossoming. But there's also the additional factor of Russia and China. Russia and China are making security agreements and Iran. Iran is sort of budding as a global power. It's been a regional power for quite a while, but it's sort of blossoming as a global power. Nations throughout the global South are developing security agreements with Russia and China, and trade deals with Iran, and then there's also the Belt and Road Initiative, which is helping nations develop out of the imposed underdevelopment and violence that colonialism wrought. Mm-hmm. And when nations develop and they have access to the basic goods of life, then they're able to practice self-determination and self-reliance. And that's what's happening. People are able now to say, we want the US out, or we want the French out. And so it's a variety of factors. It's the US weakness on the one hand, coupled with the rise and unity of other major powers like Russia and China. I mean, Russia and China, they recently met, I think in Beijing. They've had something like almost 45 meetings. Mm-hmm. It's extraordinary. 90% of their bilateral trade is either in the yuan or the Russian ruble. 90%. That's extraordinary. They're no longer using the dollar to trade. And the trade between these two countries has risen astronomically just over the last few years. And trade for oil, which has been in the dollar for decades now, 1/5 of trade for oil is not in the dollar. And this is only going to shift even more, right, with the rise of BRICS. And the economic and financial dynamics, coupled with the inability of the Americans to practice violence and militarism everywhere all the time, it's going to facilitate the end of the empire. It already is.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess another unique aspect of the US empire would be that, I mean, any empire doesn't go down without a fight. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the US does have such a massive destructive capacity is frightening, because we've seen what they're willing to unleash on Gaza. Like, they can sit there and pretend, we're telling the Israelis not to. They don't care. They're participating in it. So it is, that's certainly like supposed to probably, I'm sure the US calculation is this should be like some sort of deterrent to anybody else messing with us. Before we move on to the next topic, which is obviously related to this, you did say something that I think is important, which is that you said Israel is the most important vassal state. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious if you can explain why it's the most important one.
So the location of Israel is not a historical accident, and it has nothing to do with the Bible or religious history. The location of Israel is is a geopolitical and geostrategic decision. It's located at the juncture of three major continents, multiple important bodies of water which serve as waterways. Ansar Allah is proving the significance right now of those waterways. Nobody has proven it better than Ansar Allah. And it enabled. The other thing is that I think people often forget or don't think about is that when the U.S. gives like tens of billions of dollars to Israel for weapons and or in weapons or just in support, that money is not all being used by Israel. Israel is using that money to do the U.S.'s dirty work in other parts of the world, including Africa. So Israel, as much violence as it has incurred, as it has brought upon the people of Palestine and the rest of the region, it's also doing a lot of dirty work, basically in the Eastern Hemisphere. And I think to some extent, even South America. So because of its location and the amount of resources that it receives, it is by far the most significant player when it comes to these proxy powers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So we know who the imperialists are, right? We know it's the US, it's various proxies. The most, the ones we know the most are, of course, the European countries, Australia, Japan, Canada, all these like settler colonies. And then, you mentioned some islands. And of course, there's proxies in every continent. Whether we're talking about Latin America or the middle, or Asia, or Africa. But let's talk about the anti-imperialists. I want to ask you, what are, I guess, the current fronts of struggle against imperialism? Let's start there, and then we can kind of move to the China question here. But I don't know if you want to take us around the world, because it's not just one country. It's not just three countries. There are a lot of different movements and countries currently in their own way on their own anti-imperialist journey at the moment. So yeah, take us around the world. What are the different fronts?
So I can't cover everything, obviously, but I'll just cover maybe the major highlights.
Yeah.
Your show has covered a lot of the major highlights for folks who want to watch other episodes. So Africa is so exciting. Like right now, what's happening in Africa is so exciting. On the one hand, there is the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States, which is Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And last summer, they came out like strongly against the French. And at that point, I think many of us were thinking, is this heading toward pushing out the US, which was a significant player in that part of the world. And it did. Niger has called for the removal of the American base there, which is like the primary launcher of drone strikes on the continent. And the US, it seems like it has basically agreed to leave. I think Chad has also called for the removal of the US. The Alliance of Sahel States has met with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and made security agreements. They're talking about their own currency. This alliance, if you count the square kilometers of these three nations, the alliance together actually becomes the largest sort of landmass in Africa, even larger than the largest country in Africa. So this is very, very exciting and stands to be a serious loss for US-led imperialism. There's also the Congo, which has also strongly come out against the U.S. And there was like an American coup attempt there, though, it was not, they weren't the best troops. They weren't the most effective. And they got arrested, they got caught, they got arrested. I think the trial began last weekend. So this is an example of like the flailing nature of the U.S. imperial project, right? It can't find the people to execute its agenda, even when it has a plan and an agenda. And then, there's also South Africa, right? I mean, South Africa has always sort of been outside of, or, on the edge of the orbit of the U.S. The U.S. had tried really hard to neutralize the ANC after the fall of the apartheid state. And now it's come out strongly against the Zionist state of Israel and what the U.S. is doing in the region, in our region. And so it's not clear the extent to which this is organized, right? But there is a lot going on across Africa, both politically, economically, politically, and in terms of self-defense that really signals hope for the peoples of the global South. If you move north, obviously, what's happening in our region is very, very significant, right? The fact that the Palestinians are defending themselves against this apartheid, settler colonial, genocidal state. And they have not, the Israelis and the Americans have not been able to exact a single victory out of the Palestinians. Not a single military objective of this operation has been met. Not a single one. And when it comes to this kind of asymmetrical warfare, all the Palestinians have to do is make sure that their opponents don't win. That is it. That is it. And right now, their opponents are not winning. Biden, even in the press conference he gave a couple of weeks ago, he actually even admitted it to some extent. So it's just the fact that this small group of people that's been under such, it's like a genocide, a slow genocide prior to October, followed by an accelerated genocide, that they can exact this level of defeat is extraordinary. And it speaks to the weakness of the US-led imperialist system.
Yeah.
It also speaks to the fragility of the sectarianism that was fomented across our region for many, many years. This political sectarianism, it worked for a while. And I mean, many of us were concerned as to what would happen. It's no longer really working. The region has unified against the Zionist state and against the Americans. And the potential fall of Israel will be a major blow to the American empire, a major, major blow. And I frankly, it's hard for me to imagine what that blow will look like, whether it will force the Americans to retreat from the Eastern Hemisphere. It may force the Americans to retreat from the Eastern Hemisphere, which in and of itself would be extraordinary. Obviously, in Asia, there's China as well, and then the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And it's noteworthy that the U.S. is doing war games there in August and in the late summer, as it often does.
It's for peace, Nina.
Yes,
peace.
War games for peace, yes. How many people can you kill in order to maintain peace?
Right, exactly. Jeez.
Yeah. And then there's Latin America, there's Venezuela. I mean, Cuba, again, like Cuba and DPRK, tiny areas of land, the imperialism has sought to completely destroy them. And not only have they survived, but to some extent, they've even thrived. They've even managed to support their peoples, build socialism, and ensure that their peoples are healthy, educated, fed, housed. I mean, this is remarkable. And this is a remarkable victory, not just for those two nations, but for international socialism. The Venezuela is another front, and this is a little trickier. So Venezuela and Guyana is a little tricky, right? But the reality is that ExxonMobil began an exploration for oil in 2013, I think, and then they struck gold in 2015, and so now the Guyanese state is closely attached to ExxonMobil,
Right.
and Maduro has said that the U.S. is building a base there. The Americans deny it. It's not clear exactly what's going on, but the reality is that the battle between Venezuela and Guyana, to the extent that it gets inflamed, is also a front that involves imperialism. It is tricky. It's much trickier, I think, than other contexts. And then you have Colombia. The U.S. has been trying to, and through Kenya, has been trying to invade Haiti for many months now. Excuse me. It's still trying to, but it hasn't been able to do it. And so this is really significant. It cannot invade Haiti without, it just hasn't been able to. And so if the Haitians are able to keep the U.S. out, that's another major blow.
Yeah.
Nicaragua has always been a major front against imperialism, but what it's best known for, I think, aside from the military struggle that the Sandinistas engaged in, is its use of the courts. It won a major ICJ case against the U.S. in the 80s, and now it's using the courts against the Germans, and it's joined the South African case. So there are cracks. As a result of all these fronts, there are cracks emerging around the globe. And it's a very exciting moment.
And they're quite multifaceted too, because what you just described was different kinds of cracks, some of them military, some of them economic, some of them just the ability to survive and thrive, as you explained, with these sort of, fully blockaded countries like North Korea and Cuba. So it is really important. And then I want to go to the role here of China. Now, obviously, China isn't directly involved in all of these places. However, the rise of China has certainly created some space for these cracks to become a bit bigger. But can you explain China's role when we talk about these anti-imperialist fronts around the world?
So I forgot actually to mention the island of Kanaki, the New Caledonia as well. And I can speak specifically about China. So the New Caledonia has been scheduled to sort of have a referendum to vote for its freedom, for decolonization for many years. And the French have been sending importing settlers to sort of shift the population balance so that the vote would fall in their favor. And this has been an ongoing battle for a while now. But the current situation really came into fruition. What they say is it's the timing of it came when the Kanaki also announced that they're going to be working more closely with the Chinese, in exchange and doing mineral exports. And so in addition to the security agreements that I mentioned earlier, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which gives nations the economic fundamentals to be self-reliant as they engage in national liberation struggles or fight for their self-determination. Also, China and Russia have established security agreements with nations throughout the world. And this gives them a measure, not a lot, but a measure of safety. Also, the declining use of the dollar is significant because now nations have other countries to look to, and the declining use of the dollar in conjunction with sanctions. Sanctions have basically backfired in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so now nations that are under sanctions have other countries to look to, major countries, to engage in trade, and to build their societies. So it's what is evident, what is public and what is evident is both direct and indirect effects of the rise of China around the world. Now, does this mean that the world is going to turn socialist tomorrow? Like, if the US falls on Tuesday, we're going to have socialism on Wednesday? No, of course not. That's not how politics works. But what China has called for, and a series of other nations around the world, is multipolarity, which means that we respect the heterogeneity of our cultures and our struggles around the world, and we sit at the table as equals. Each of us sits at the table as a political and economic equal. And we're no longer going to be pushed around by people who want to rape our women and kill our men so they can steal our land and our resources, and maybe even our children, or kill their children, or kill our children.
Well, that's very powerfully put. And before we zoom in more on our region, I wanted to ask you if you could speak to the issue of what I call the two-state delusion. And I mean, we're used to hearing this obviously pushed the hardest by people who don't mean it. And that is like Western countries who are always talking about two states, like especially the United States saying that about Israel-Palestine, when we know that they don't care if Palestine ever has a state. And also, like, as you know, leftists, we don't support the idea of two segregated states where there still gets to be one state that's a settler colony that abides by a Jewish supremacist ideology when there are many non-Jews that live there. But putting that aside for a moment, I do think it's also important to note that I think a lot of people in the international community, and I've heard this from like diplomats and people who work for the UN, they're well aware that that the two-state solution is a delusion and it's just a talking point. And it doesn't actually mean anything. But we do hear a lot of countries, even those that we consider allies of the Palestinians, support the idea of a two-state solution, at least in rhetoric. And that includes countries like China, like Russia. Even, I mean, I think even Hamas technically supports a two-state solution, at least on paper. All that's to say, how, can you put that, when it comes to the two-state solution and the support for it from the allies of anti-imperialism in the sort of non-aligned bloc, if you will, countries like China, how do you explain that? Like, how should we understand the support for that delusion?
I love two-state delusion. That's a great way to characterize it. So before I answer your question directly, I'm going to talk about why it's delusional, because it is indeed delusional. So first of all, it's completely impractical, right? The West Bank is riddled with Zionist settlements. Like, if you look at a map of the West Bank, those color-coded maps, it's riddled with Zionist settlements, right? So what would the two-state be, right, in terms of actual territory? I mean, we have to be practical here, right? This is a question of land. We have to be practical. The project of a two-state solution is reminiscent of what the imperialists wanted to do in South Africa, which is create Bantustans across South Africa. The Bantustanization, it's called the Bantustanization of the region. South Africa rejected it, right? They were very clear that they're not going to have a giant Bantustan living where Black people are forced to live amongst their killers and their rapists. So how could it possibly make sense for the Palestinians to accept this? And the reality is that it's the two-state delusion or solution is the normalization of violence against our peoples, against Arabs and Iranians. That's all it is. Because Israel is not only telling its people, go and kill the Palestinians. I'm talking not just about the military, I'm talking about the settlers, the quote unquote civilians, right? It's arming them to do it. And it's telling them, try and try and try again until you are successful at getting their homes and their land. How could you possibly coexist with this level of violence? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any political sense. So now to the question of, I'll add that it's not just the Arab peoples that have been subject to this, or the people of Palestine. Iran has also suffered greatly from the presence of Israel in the region. And so because of that, Iran's national liberation struggle is still incomplete. It's still incomplete. So the region as a whole cannot be free so long as the entity is there in this current form, which is why Palestinians around the world, except for the PA, have called for a singular state where people live in equality and dignity and without apartheid and occupation. Now, to the question of why the two-state delusion has sway among people and nations that it should not have sway among. I think in large part, I hope in large part it's because of the PA. Because if the PA is the Palestinian Authority, right, the sort of official government of Palestine on paper, it's not an official government of Palestine. Were not voted in. It was not a democratic. They were brought in by Israel and the Americans mostly. If they're calling for a two-state solution, and they're the official entity that the nations around the world have to deal with, and they are, right? You hear this regularly from nations all around the world, especially in the non-aligned bloc, that irrespective of their views of the PA, they have to work with the PA because that's the official entity. Otherwise, they would be like disrespecting the Palestinians as a whole.
Right.
If the PA is calling for a two-state solution, how can the what is it? The kettle be hotter than the pot, or whatever? The Chinese or the Venezuelans or the Nicaraguans or whatever, the South Africans cannot be 5 steps ahead of the Palestinians.
Right.
And that's a fundamental contradiction that the Palestinians are resolving, right? Through the struggle, they are now fighting to resolve this contradiction. But it's a contradiction, everybody's talking about the day after, right? The day after in Gaza. Gaza is not just Gaza. Gaza is Palestine. Mm-hmm. And the day after in Palestine requires a resolution to the Palestinian question, not just to Gaza. And this means that nations have to think critically about this two-state delusion. It's not going to work. And the proof is in the pudding, right? To use another cliche. Nobody is more against the two-state solution than the Israelis themselves. There is no one in the world that's more against it than the Israelis. And that's because they don't want to live amongst a bunch of brown Arabs and Muslims. They don't want to live amongst us because they're fundamentally racist. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't have to live with people that want us dead.
No.
That's not fair.
100% agreed. We should not have to live with people that want us dead. I want to move then to the people who are fighting that, and that is the resistance axis. And when we talk about the resistance axis here, we're talking about some countries like Iran, like Yemen, under the control of Ansar Allah, more popularly in the West is the Houthis, the armed Palestinian groups that are fighting across Gaza and the West Bank, as well as, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria. We're talking about the resistance-aligned groups in Iraq. And this axis has proven to be quite powerful. When you just look at the Middle East today in 2024 compared to the Middle East of, let's say, 2003, when you had the invasion of Iraq, And, nobody was able to really do anything, much to stop it. The region was kind of like a free for all for whatever the US wanted to do. You have a very, very different region today. So I want to ask you a couple questions as it relates to the resistance axis. And I think an important one, and we talked about this in the episode I did with you last, but I think it's important to maybe reemphasize, especially post genocide in Gaza. That's the importance of Iran. And I think it's really, Iran, this axis could not really exist properly without Iran. This is why the U.S. sanctions Iran so heavily, not just because Iran refuses to submit to like Western countries wanting to steal its oil, but also Iran as a mechanism of defense, of its own national defense strategy across the region, has aligned with partners who have similar interests related to anti-imperialism, and has played a huge role in funding, arming, helping to organize and sort of be a communications collaboration, base, if you will, for these different movements. So when we talk about the anti-imperialist struggle in the region, can you talk about the importance of Iran when it comes to that?
So the knowledge that Iran's role as a central role in the resistance did not emerge in a vacuum. And it resulted from an accumulation of knowledge over the course of the last several decades. Iran has been subject to US imperialism, as we talked about in the last episode, at least since the 50s, when the democratically elected government of Mossadegh fell as a result of the coup. It was forced to fall as a result of the coup, the US-led coup. But in terms of military capacity, after the 1979 revolution, right after the 1979 revolution, the Iran-Iraq War began. And this was one of the first major proxy wars in the contemporary era, US proxy wars in the contemporary era. The US backed Iraq, sent weapons, provided strategic support, and it was an 8-year war that was devastating for both the Iraqis and the Iranians. And there was significant knowledge accumulated during that struggle regarding how the Americans fight, how the Americans support their proxies, how their proxies execute the American agenda. And so this is a significant reason why Iran is able, I don't want to say lead, because it's not really, it's not a leadership role, but it's certainly wisdom. It's more than, it's different than leading. It's like wisdom, right? It's the wisdom of leadership that's really important. That's fueling the resistance in the region, that's guiding the resistance in the region. There's also the fact of the matter is that because Iran left the US orbit a long time ago, it was forced to become self-reliant. And self-reliance is different than self-determination. Self-reliance means being able to practice, to put your own independence into practice. And I'm a firm believer that even though we can ally with nations like China or whoever else, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, whatever, we have to be self-reliant. Liberated peoples must be able to feed themselves, to support themselves, and to practice self-defense.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.